definition. And now, as soon as you come with the definition of the genre, you are going to face a long line list of the subcategories. And you know that, as a matter of fact, every categorization is a reductionist approach. We reduce the feature of a phenomenon to some decided points, and by those decided points, we actually face other problems, because as a matter of fact, the novel belongs to the context of art, the context of fiction, which is more problematic. And defining the art and saying that the art has these features, then everybody can be an artist. Because of that, probably the best thing is that not to define the art. If you define the art, we can go and learn it and then produce artistic works, which is something that we do not do that. We haven't been able to do that, during the whole history. Now, based on this, more problematic will be the subcategory of the novel, historical novel. Then you have two problems. What is history and what is the novel, and how you combine them, merge them, and come to more problematic. Now, we have Professor Buzarsalan. I don't dare to say anything about history, but just because of this project that I have had, I have tried to understand what history as a term, not as a term, as a concept, but as a word means. Okay, Greek, and not Jamal Nabazian, I mean etymology, but the real what's called etymology. I wanted to follow Jamal Nabaz and say it means high story. But story is so important in the history. And it is not the case. It is not high story. It is history in some Scandinavian languages. Still, it is called historia, and it means to investigate, to study, to focus on something, to know what it is about. And novel, as a matter of being a fictional text, it is something that happens here in Jan Dost's mind. Now, he wants to write about Ahmadi Khani, that he has done it. Ahmadi Khani, okay, 300 years ago. What is going he to do? Is he going to do actually to write his memories, his books, analyze Mamuzin that he has done both in Arabic and Kurdish, and he has published the new version of Kurdish of Mamuzin in today's language? No, he doesn't do that. He simply writes Mirnama, and in Mirnama, he is supposed, if he is loyal to the principles of historical novel as it has been theorized by Lukács. Lukács is the master of theorizing historical novel. In the early 19th century, a guy, Sir Walter Scott from Scott, in 1814 actually, he published his famous book, Waverley. And between 1814 and 32, when he passed away, in more than 20 years, he published 22 novels, very productive. And those novels actually, for Georgi Lukács, as a known Marxist, distributed or showed or exhibited or narrated the essence of the time that Sir Walter Scott was working with. Waverley is the reflection of the Jacobite uprising or movement in the middle of 18th century, exactly in the 1745, and the way that Waverley as an imaginary character represents his time. Now, in the Marxist tradition, we had what once Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx had in passing talked about Balzac. All the Balzac was a royalist, a guy that actually appreciated the system, but he ironically wrote a book about the peasants. And in the book of the peasants, he doesn't mean to actually appreciate the nice work of the peasants. He wants to warn the king that, be careful, these guys, these peasants may be very dangerous in the future for you. And Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels call this lovely royalist guy as the one who understands the essence and the pure reality of his own time. This same ironical approach to the historical novelist writers happens again in the case of Georgi Lukács, when the guy, Sir Walter Scott, as a who was called conservative member, he's a sir. But for Lukács, he is a progressive man. It is due to his books that we understand these transformation of the social systems in the greater, European context, or United Kingdom, or Great Britain. What all this have to do with our part of the world, with the Middle East? It has a very related, close connection to the modernization, to the industrialization, to the individualization process in the Middle East, which is not finished. I wonder if it has started, but late 19th century, early 20th century, in the contents of the Arab nationalism in Iran, Turkish nationalism, we came first with the translation of these words from European context to the Arabic, Turkish, and Persian, and later on imitating these novels. It is very interesting that in Iran, because of the early European historical novels that were translated into Persian, and they were 3 volumes, almost all the early Persian novels are in 3 volumes. They saw that probably if you have it in 2 or 3, it is not a good novel. It is not a real historical novel. And the Reza Shah, or the Pahlavi's nationalist approach to take this stance from the Islamic period of Iran's history and going back to the pre-Islamic time, motivated, encouraged the authors of Iran to write and to produce mass novels. A guy who was just 15 years old, his name was Zain al-Abidin Mu'tamin. He wrote tens of what's called historical novels. 3 volumes, again, 3 volumes, of the Nest of the Eagle. And all the figures actually were from the pre-Islamic, world, in which they wanted to promote this kind of nationalism that was the main discourse in the case of Iran in the early decades of the 20th century. Now, this fictional aspect, this balance of fiction and reality, or truth, or calling these books as the historical novel, is again problematic. I don't think that among us there are so old peoples that remember 1984 by George Orwell, which was published in 1949, actually. We all know that it's a dystopia. It's a work that has to do with his frightened, approach to communism. At that time, Time magazine published a great novel. Now we are in 217. Is it a historical novel or a despotic novel? Not despotic, despotia or dystopia. Actually, if you read it from a historical point of view, it's a historical novel now. Now, what I want to argue is that a piece of work can be historical now, political now, in some years later can be historical. It is exactly with Jan Dost Kobane. Jan Dost is himself from Kobane and has written his book just 2 years ago, a few months after actually Kobane's great resistance. And in 408 pages, almost 140 pages are the author's own memories of the city. Actually, he appears as a postmodernist novel as Jan Dost. He goes and participates in the meetings as an activist for supporting peace in Kobane, and he calls Jan Dost. He writes letters in the novel. It is called Jan Dost. But at the same time, he has a fictional world in that novel, a family, Haji Muslim's family, very political. And I wished this novel, could be read as a historical novel. I did it actually, because it is a history of 2 years ago. Now in the Lukácsian, terminology, we talk about at least one generation back in the time, not, very 2 years ago, and he is from, the very city. But what happens if after 50 years people read this book? It is absolutely a historical novel. And I know by reading the novel, I noticed very exact days of the occupation of the city by ISIS, the second time of going into the city and killing about hundreds of people, and a family that has a guy in Rosh, Peshmerga, Metin, Roshan in the YPG, Metin in the Kandil mountain that has come back to fight and defend Kobane against the Daesh, and a very lovely guy who just plays, his baghlama. He is very sensitive. Not anybody should call it tambur. It is baghlama. And then he has been beheaded by the Daesh in Raqqa. And Hama, the very, guy that was the second son of Haji Muslim, who has married to his brother's wife, Aisha, and that brother was killed in Syrian army. He was, given the title of martyr for Assad's regime. And you see all this strange combination that raise a question. What is the essence of this novel? What this novel tells us? Oh gosh, 2 minutes. Conclusion. I can, go on and discuss his other works, but for sometimes that, you can read my article about this, because I have the intention, the ambition to compare this one with the Turkish, Iranian, Arab context, with Georgi Zeydan, with this Mu'tamen guy, with the others, and then coming to the very conclusion, who are the features that have been depicted in these novels? Ahmed Khani, a literary figure, Qazi Muhammad in Mujabad, Badin himself, Jan Dost in one of his interviews says, I am Badin Ahmedi. And Badin can be interpreted, the wild wind or whatever, or Badina. And, he's traveled through all corners of Kurdistan, from Ahmedi to southern Kurdistan, participating from his father's side in Sheikh Mahmoud's uprising, then together with the Mustafa Barzani's troops going to Mahabad, and in Mahabad finding accidentally his father or his father-in-law. It's a very interesting novel as far as Mujabad is considered. I hope in the time of questions you raise questions about the very general thing that I discussed to make it more specified. Thank you very much.